Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study. My name is Prof Maphai. I'm the director of the Institute. We are quite excited today to have this seminar by Professor Maphai. And I was thinking some few minutes ago, how do you introduce and welcome to the Vice Chancellor of the University of Johannesburg? He had said to me, he had apologized that he was not coming. So I was thinking, how do you introduce somebody like Professor Vincent Maphai, who has such an extraordinary career? And most of you know him and the work that he has done. His career stretches academia, government, the corporate sector. In fact, he has spent about 20 years in the corporate sector, and he has spent 20 years in academia.
Don't tell them my age.
About 40 years or 18 years. I mean, you check everything in government, in academia, in the corporate sector, his name is there. Recently, he was a visiting professor in Williams College in Massachusetts. And you know, at the beginning of this year, we met him with the Vice Chancellor here at the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study. We were trying to convince him to join us.
Not to go to Pretoria.
Not go to the University of Pretoria. Heavens also to be his home. And we thought we were not going to succeed. But life has interesting surprises. So he decided to join us. He, for the past few months, he was a senior research fellow. And last week, the Council of the University of Johannesburg appointed him an honorary professor. Both in the Department of Politics as well as here at the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study. So the professor is going to spend the rest of his life here. That's how excited we are. You know, I've seen these slides, and that's the reason why I'm so excited about this seminar this evening. I was asking my colleagues here, how do you pronounce the title? I mean, is it called Vadis? Is it called what is South Africa? We'll leave it to you, Professor, to tell us how to pronounce it. And we'll give it to you to start presenting. We welcome all of you. I mean, in the past few weeks, we have had extraordinary seminars. In fact, last week, there was a seminar on relations between Nigeria and South Africa, which was presented by Professor Maphai. Of course, it took us what Professor we were sharing, because it was 3 hours of debate, very frank debate. It was exciting, it was saving, and we hope we will have the same here. And welcome to you, Professor.
No, thanks very much. The only reason I gave a Latin title was that when I was a student, you wouldn't get a girlfriend unless you knew Shakespeare or something. And then just those 2 credentials make everybody think you are a heavyweight. But on a more serious note, I was trying to figure out how do I explain today, and I thought the best way to give a context to what I'm doing now, and I'll stand up afterwards, is to tell you how I discovered I was joining the ranks of senior citizens. Everywhere I went at some point, everybody said, "Eta Province." And then almost as if by conspiracy, suddenly it changed to Eta Uncle. Overnight, I stopped being Province, became Uncle Vince. And then I'll say, Kunjani Sisi Ampilile Baba, you know. Then another upgrade. But what broke my back was when I was in an airport bus from the terminal to the aircraft, As soon as I came in, a young boy stood up immediately to offer me the seat. So after that, I had to go to HR to discuss a dignified exit. I think there were a few messages which said I had reached my self-identity. Now, what I'm actually doing today is to look for those bras, those uncles, those babas, and those meritorious recipients of seats in a crowded bus in the whole of South Africa, to say there are a few landmarks. Can we derive in the same way that I came to the conclusion that on the basis of these landmarks, I should make a dignified exit from active ministry in education and other things? So that's where I come from. I just want to give that as a context, that I'm not predicting anything. This is not a scenario. This is not throwing bones. And it will be boring. It won't be about Julius Malema. It won't be about Judge Zondo. But I just pick up a few interlocking signals to say, is there something to learn from this? So that's the first comment I wanted to make about the context of today. The second thing, when I teach honor students, the first thing I teach them is good research comes from troubling questions. There must be a question that gives you sleepless nights and you say, I better go into this. Then I think it will give you good research. And let me tell you what keeps me awake. When I grew up, the most advanced technology was a typewriter. Vadis, South Africa means where are you going, right? I've already told you what is this. I want to look at the political culture, and there are a few correlations I'll be looking at, but nothing as yet will be declared a course. I'm not there yet. And I said I chose 6 areas that are interlocking together to begin to create a certain kind of culture in the country. Let me start with my bees in the bonnet. The first thing that strikes me is black South Africans, and I use race for good reasons. Black South Africans have a very, very uneasy relationship with the state. And this struck me early in 1996, 97, I can't remember. And I've monitored it, I've seen it throughout. You remember there was a time when we talked of a rainbow nation. And because I worked for brewery, I had many friends. And I used to host some games at home on the big screen. And I'm serious what I'm going to tell you. It was a rugby game. And it was a rainbow nation. When the national anthem started, all the Afrikaners stood up immediately. All the English liberals were sitting. And we Dagis were not sure whether we were sitting, standing, or squatting. It was a most bizarre situation. And I debated with myself, why was that the case? And you will notice that that attitude continues to bedevil us as a country. Afrikaners, not surprising. They've been running the state, so the state is not an enemy to them. What we forgot about the correlation between liberalism and English liberals is that the English lost control of the state in 1910. And liberalism is actually an ideology of estrangement. People who have no relationship with the state as something to fight with. And we black people are caught up in between that kind of dilemma. If you look at most of our journalists, they tend to follow the liberal tradition of estrangement. Everything government does is wrong. And if you support government on anything, you are not independent. And I think this issue, black people need to confront and deal with it, but it's one of the reasons that are confronting us. The ANC itself has displayed a certain reluctance to rule. The ANC does not run the government with confidence. There's no sense of we are in charge, take it or leave it. Nothing like that. We are apologetic. And Ade, you will see how some of these things begin to impact on the issues the two of you were discussing last week. Now look at certain things. The government hasn't built your street. And in order to get the government to build a road, you organize a school boycott. What's the connection between those two? I remember, when I was an altar boy, a Catholic altar boy, we were angry with our priest. And we said, Father, we are going to boycott Mass. He said, my children, whose soul will go to hell after all. And all I'm saying is, if you use your children, you undermine their education to fight a political war. Who is suffering? It's your children. Make no mistake about it. You haven't helped them a lot. But these things happen. That's what I'm saying. I'm trying to figure out. You know, university students like to ban lecture halls in order to improve education. Isn't it?
Yeah, we had an auditorium that was banned.
And the purpose was to improve education, right? I'm not talking about the recent strike, but there was a strike organized by COSATU about 2 years ago to march against unemployment. Now, I'm not quite sure how a strike is going to create jobs. I'm just saying these are things I'm trying to figure out. What's in our culture that we do these things that are inexplicable? In the city center of Joburg a few weeks ago, the police had to run away. They were chased by illegal immigrants carrying bricks. They ran away. And the Minister of Police is still in his job.
Very much.
It doesn't end there. A few weeks later, President Ramaphosa sent some envoys to apologize. I looked at Jeff Hadel. He looked like the two of them, and I know them, they are my friends, they really look like head prefects who were caught smoking in a private school during classes and had to apologize before the whole assembly. The two events were the most humiliating spectacle. What explains these kinds of things? When Bafana, Springboks and Proteas failed, we fired a coach. When a Minister of Education destroys our children, we call them comrades. What's going on? What's the sense? What is our sense of what is important? So these are questions I've been battling with. And my overriding impression is the amazing inability of both the ANC and South Africans to claim ownership of the country. That needs some explanation. I don't know what it is, but it is bizarre. What is my key thesis? And I will demonstrate, or I will show a certain correlation between social problems that start under apartheid and become exacerbated since 1994. I will also demonstrate that the most effective strategies against apartheid have turned out to be an albatross around our neck. And we are not dealing with that. Conversely, the least effective state strategy has actually become a blessing in disguise for post-South Africa. And we are not dealing with those ironies. And here it's speculation that the apartheid government is gone. You must not rule out the decimation of the two anti-apartheid parties, the TA and the ANC. They might also disappear sooner than we think. Because both parties have got one thing in common. They are still anti-apartheid parties instead of moving on. So we need to monitor them. Right. Something I thought is missing in our studies as social scientists, and I might be wrong, I haven't been full-time on this. We don't draw enough parallels between the ANC and the National Party. Because my feeling is if we do that, it might begin to explain some of the madness that I've pointed out before. The first thing we forget is that both of them were liberation movements. Both of them were liberation movements. Both of them fought the anti-colonial struggle against the British. Both of them are in desperate need to be endorsed by the West. It's interesting, it doesn't matter how much support came from Eastern Europe. The ANC still genuflects when it deals with the West. And if you noticed, after 1994, nobody even knew where the Soviet Union, who Russians were. The whole focus went to the West. And even under apartheid, the National Party always wanted to show that it's because the West is stupid, it doesn't understand that the apartheid is a very democratic system, and we will explain very slowly to them, they will see the point. That chronic desire to be endorsed by the West, it's common to both parties. Both of them have no consequence management for incompetence. If you are incompetent, you are either promoted or redeployed. Look at Ramaphosa's cabinet. It's pathetic. Cadre deployment, very sacred to both of them. Both of them historically collectivist. What do I mean? The core of liberalism, to use Kennedy's words, is that the individual is prime value. The individual is the primary value of society. Everything starts with the individual and you move there. And if you look at the development of liberal theory, it has always been the emphasis on the individual. Leave that one for now. For the National Party, a person is primarily a member of a group, not primarily an individual. Primarily a member of a group, and everything follows from that. And it follows if you step out, if you stop supporting the National Party, you are actually undermining your own culture and you need rehabilitation, and we know what form that rehabilitation to. The ANC was unapologetic about the principle of subordination of the individual to the collective. So both of them are strong collectivists, very strongly anti-liberal in their thinking, in sociology, in their psychology. Now go back to the third, last principle about their similarities. Both of them are unable to deal with unrest. First they cause it. You tell them, I'm unhappy. They think there's something wrong with you. You bend down a building, they come running. So a culture has been developed. If you notice, the National Party, Alexander is a good example under the National Party. They tried to squash it, it failed. Alexander went wild, and then they put 45 million into Alexander to quell it. And then Soweto says, so this is how you qualify for 45 million. And they started banning as well. The ANC is no better. It doesn't listen, and it just, until you start banning, both of them are the same. both settled for an ultra-liberal constitution in 1994. Quite an irony. And both of them have learned for the first time how to work on a win-win culture. And now, if you look at today, we have gone back to a zero-sum game. It's no longer about the win-win, it's about how I finish you off. There are also important differences. The National Party was single-minded in implementing apartheid. The ANC prevaricates. It consults for 10 years and it's still confused about what it wants to do. The National Party, it's interesting. It started its own institutions. The ANC started no institutions. It wants to transform theirs. There's no university of consequence that was started by the ANC with a clear political mission. The National Party said, we are not going to waste our time. We'll build false scars instead of trying to transform Barclays Bank and so on. The National Party had clear constituency and it had clear policy orientation. For obvious reasons, the constituency of the ANC is much wider, and there is as much policy as there are constituencies. Not very clear where you are going. National Party, very authoritarian. The ANC has a culture of consultation very strongly. This is linked to the first one. National Party never apologized for its exercise of its use of political power. They said, we got a mandate and we are going to do what we have to do. With us, we have to explain ourselves all the time, especially to the West. That's bullet, sorry. It's not gin and tonic, it's pure water. That's bullet, it's important. And remind me to scold Malema about it.
Kind of.
The National Party used public institutions. They went to public schools. There were no private schools. They went to public hospitals. The Afrikaner middle class used public institutions. There was no ADT. They made sure that the police did their job. You see, Mugabe didn't die in a public hospital in Harare. He was in Singapore in a 7-star hospital. How many of our politicians, including unions and everybody, use public schools? And I always say with the NHI, watch it carefully. The first people to fight it when it starts operating is going to be the unions, especially COSATU, and I'll come back to that point. What accounts for this? Now, this is the core of my paper. Sorry I waffled so long. But the rest of the presentation is about these two questions. How do liberation movement strategies impact on societies afterwards? Or to put differently, are some of our problems today in the result of inherent structure of the liberation movement? We mustn't blame anybody. This is just the way it has to be. Just as you can't become an old man without becoming a teenager. This is what I'm hoping to figure out. I'm going to look at 6. These are the 6 things that I think, if you are looking at South Africa where it's going, at least get a bit of understanding about all of them. And I'll run very quickly. And you will see that the 6 are interlinked, and yeah, there is a structural connectedness about all of them. Let's start with developments of the ANC, and I'm going to go very quickly. Yeah, sorry. The ANC is a broad church which was combined only by the anti-apartheid ethos. As long as you are against apartheid, you are welcome. It is underpinned by 4 traditions. Those traditions differ in strategies and culture. The first tradition is the golden oldies in Robben Island. Madiba, Sisulu represent that. Very wise, very reflective. If you are in jail for 28 years, you have time to reflect. What else can you do? So they reflected, and it's not an accident that Robben Island was called university. There are good reasons for that. These guys tend to be unemotional, very thoughtful, very strategic, and strong long-term vision. The next one is what I call Lucifer Bureaucrats. The civil servants who were based in exile. Mbeki, Tambo. They were not in the camps. They were the bureaucrats. And where they were very active was in pushing the armed propaganda and the international mobilization of the struggle, underground and so on. What is special about them? Very secretive. If you are underground, you don't talk to the person next door. And anybody you don't recognize is an enemy agent. And you will see the consequences of this. You can't be an underground person and have a loose tongue. You are very, very careful who you get close to. And then there was a military wing, Chris Hani, Zuma, Joe Modise. An army is an army, finish and clear. It's not a democratic institution. A democratic army is useless. And then you had the mass democratic movement internally. Trevor Manuel, Lekota, all the people who were in the country. What characterizes them? It's high levels of accountability. They are used to being asked questions. They are being asked, who gave you the power to tell me what to do? They are militant. You will notice that during negotiation, these 2 parties, 1 and 2, were the ones keen on negotiations. The last 2 are not keen on negotiations. Internal people were saying, we have pressurized the government enough. Give us more time, we will bring it down. I hope you begin to see the cultures that I'm talking about, that the orientation is quite different. And so Rivonia, all this, some of them like Madiba were in the army, but generally they were not active in the last few years. Lusaka bureaucrat, they totally destroyed South Africa's image outside. Umkhonto was military, and internal activists were responsible for internal mobilization. Sorry. And the point I'm saying, you see, this is the point. I'll come back at the bottom. I'll come back to it. Armed struggle, look at the numbers I've put there. And the last one, the bottom one, it's not international mobilization, it's internal mobilization. By one, I mean it was the most successful strategy. International isolation was the second most effective strategy. Underground was a principle across the board. And armed struggle was the least successful. And what I'm saying is the least successful strategies prove the bonus for consolidation of democracy. And number one, it's our biggest nightmare, as I will demonstrate. As I've said. In some cases, the most successful strategies exacerbated the social problems we are facing today, and lawlessness has a root. Now, I said ANC had 4 strategies. If you think that's sufficiently complicated, bring in the tripartite alliance in it. It's COSATU. Now COSATU, it's a shadow of its glorious past. But what is interesting about COSATU is that now it consists of middle-class unions, mainly the teachers who are the most organized and public servants. So you now have public servants being bosses of the ruling party at the same time. That's the anomaly about having COSATU as part of a ruling alliance. Diminishing working class base, middle class civil servants, educators, and health workers. Were you not surprised that COSATU pushed a strong line against the toll roads? Now ask if you have domestic servants at home, ask them if they give 2 hoots how much you are paying for toll roads. It's not a working class issue, it's a middle class issue. And that already tells you where COSATU was positioned in the whole thing. SACP. Frankly, it's a fly on the elephant's back. I don't think the SACP will dare go for election alone. There's no future. If the ANC dies, it will die. So, all I'm saying is the value proposition of the alliance is something to be questioned today. It was important at one point. Is it still helpful today to whom? And I think it adds to the ANC's problems. And what I'm saying is those 4 traditions combined with the alliance turn the ANC into a rudderless party, which has become a lame duck. It's not quite clear what actually defines the ANC, and maybe some of you can help me. To say it's non-racial and non-sexism, please. Where to? Point 1, as we speak, the ANC is in a zero-sum situation, and I don't know if President Ramaphosa doesn't want to see that or he's got a better strategy. The reality about the ANC, it will never be united. One part must completely finish off the other part. There won't be reconciliation, forget it. You can call it Codesa, and that is why I said we have problems there. The ANC is facing steep decline in its fortunes, and the liberation dividend has lost its value. You know, liberation movements like to remind you how they liberated you. Now the problem is that language makes sense to me, and I can tell you there was liberation. People say nothing has changed. I've lived under apartheid. I can tell you a lot has changed. My children might say maybe. My grandchildren, you cannot liberate people who were never slaves. My grandchildren only know freedom, so if you want to win them over, don't tell them you have liberated them from what? From their parents' spanking. That's probably the only liberation you can talk about. I actually think the ANC is terminally ill. I think so. Yes. I think so. It's sad. I don't think it will recover. The bloodletting, if you are in a zero-sum game, you fight till everybody has died. You fight till they finish. Right. So we finished with the ANC. We said we must look at the legacy of the past. Apartheid is part of it, but it's over-researched. I want to look at the legacy of the liberation struggle. The armed struggle was never a military struggle in the same way you saw in Zimbabwe elsewhere. And it's interesting, the ANC always referred to the armed struggle, armed propaganda. But you haven't heard of a major war such as we have seen in Zimbabwe and other places. Oh no, I've done this, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You want to correct one?
Right. Let's look at the impact of the armed struggle. It was a political rather than military. One thing we have to thank both the ANC and the National Party is that they were firm on the principle that civilians must exercise control over the army. And we are very lucky. Have you noticed right now in all the internal fights of the ANC, the army has been aloof. It's intelligence agencies that have been actually caught up in these functions. The army has been very professional. Let me behave like an undergraduate teacher. Who knows the chief of the army in South Africa? Good, don't tell us. Now, this is a good sign for the country. The chief of the army should be the most irrelevant person to us because we are not at war. I suspect in Nigeria, many people know who the head of the army is. Zimbabwe, they know. And precisely because the MK was so military weak, a coup d'etat in South Africa is an unlikely scenario. If there were to be a military coup, you are going to get the EFF and the Freedom Front Plus leading a march against the army together. I don't think there will be a military coup in this country. The army doesn't have a culture. And guess how stupid we are? Now we use the army in the Western Cape. I think it's a serious mistake. It's the job of the police to look for drug dealers, not that of the army. Our army should be protecting our borders, not theirs. You actually now bring the army into a political situation. If they fail, are we going to discredit our army? The army has been disciplined, and we now bring them into politics when it has never been their culture. Impact of strategies underground. It's common in any revolutionary struggle, most intense within the exile community. A culture of secrecy is very strong and understandably so. You operate with those you know and trust, and the consequence of that is cadre deployment. Cadre deployment is not corruption. It's a logical consequence of underground work. The National Party did it. The ANC is doing it. And these are what I call the structural unintended consequences of a police. What was the impact of international isolation? Boycotts and isolation were a major blow to white South Africa. Many of us don't appreciate the fact that the biggest bonus to white South Africa post-1994 was South Africa beating New Zealand. That was seen as the fruit of liberation. We were now part of the global community, and we were blacksmithing them. It was really, really important, that thing. Number two, apartheid has always positioned itself as a bastion against communism. So acceptance to the Western world was a bonus. What is WRC? World Rugby Cup, yeah. Yes. That's right. However, what has been the problem with international mobilization in CPAC is the problem I made earlier. Observation that South Africans still think the world owns us. We haven't learned to tell the world this is where we draw the line. Take it or lump it, but this is the way we do things. There is chronic need for endorsement, I've said that. The government, apologetic, explains itself too much, no sense of drawing the line. Yeah, now let's come to our biggest nightmare. This is the most successful strategy. Look at its consequences. First of all, in the 80s, schools and education institutions became sites of confrontation with the apartheid government. Today, they've become sites of confrontation with the ANC government. Inexact transfer of mentality. The country is ungovernable. And the strategy in the 80s was making the country ungovernable. We succeeded, and it's still ungovernable today. Complete lawlessness. Now, lawlessness is interesting. It's an example of what I said about problems starting with apartheid and exacerbated by us. Under apartheid, if you have never been to jail, you had to explain why. Jail was a bad badge of honor. It was. If you haven't been, you have to explain why. Like Martin Luther said, non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as cooperation with good. So non-cooperation with apartheid was a virtue. The ANC comes in and says, we agree with you. We will make the country ungovernable. We will not obey. And that is why lawlessness is so common in the country. The only way you can make a country ungovernable is destroying the authority of parents, educators, and law enforcement. If these structures are intact, the country will be governable. I wish I could spend more time, but the African male was the first casualty of this. And I hope somebody in gender studies will link that with gender violence. You see, the African male was destroyed by migratory labor system. And the next person who does that is my generation in the 70s, in the Black Consciousness movement. Our message was very clear: our adults have sold us out, they are useless, we are going to take over the country. By 1976, high school students were saying, these university students are far too intellectual, we will show them how to do it. But you have actually seen, since the early 70s till today, the country being taken over altogether by young people. And what was also specific was young people exercised power over which nobody held them accountable. And the African man becomes increasingly emasculated, totally. Educators, I can say a lot. But one thing we don't look at, schools and education from the 70s. I mean, I matriculated in 1969. We were the last generation to have a full, not generation, the last age group to have a full education uninterrupted. My wife starts university in 1970, and the first thing she started with was a strike. And every year, since then, there's never been a time when there was no strike. In 1984, education in townships collapses totally. There was no education. What was the common feature? The teachers continued to be paid in this period. No education, but they were being paid. Did you notice in 1994, who was the first person to go on strike? Bantu education teachers. And the logic is simple. They haven't worked for 15 years, they got paid. Now expecting them to work is an unfair labor practice. And that is why our biggest nightmare is teachers in education, in black schools. And all of them have sent their children to private schools. You see, I'll tell you why I said I'm angry with Malema. Malema said, when I become president, all civil servants and public servants and politicians will only use public institutions. I tell you, if you do that, our education will improve in a few weeks. I can come back to that, but typical of Malema, just when you say, what a brilliant thing, then he gets sidetracked with some theatrics and eventually forget the most important thing that he had said. Law enforcement, do I need to say more? Why do our police? I'll come back to that. I've said that bullet. And this is, at this point, I want to make, just in passing, differences between Zimbabwe and South Africa. South Africans are highly active, have highly active and politicized civil society. Zimbabwe, highly militarized, with a largely, I'm not saying totally, largely dominant civil society. You know, what I find interesting, a coup in Zimbabwe, a march was organized against Mugabe, but that march was organized by the army, not by civil servants. There's something wrong there. What are the long-term implications? South Africa has a better chance of consolidating its democracy than Zimbabwe. I haven't seen. I think authoritarianism, especially of a military type in Zimbabwe, is there to stay for some time until civil society actually takes place. But I just wanted to use that as a thing, internal mobilization, successful yet lethal, I said. Pressure on apartheid government which defended on authority, legal impact, law and order, collapsed. And people said there's a rise in crime. I wonder if there is a rise in crime or whether the main problem is a dysfunctional justice system. It's something that needs to be interrogated. Collapse of African and colored communities, particularly the African male. The African male, emasculated by migratory labor system, and then by the Black consciousness movement, and I come from that group, where we said the adults are useless, we will show you how to liberate. High school students says this university intellectuals are useless, we will show you how to do it. And you will notice what comes after all of this. And somebody in gender studies, it's worth doing if there's any causal relation between the emasculation of the African male and high rates of gender-based violence. It's worth looking into that as a study. I can go on that. The only way you can make the country ungovernable is when you disempower parents, when you disempower teachers, and when you disempower law enforcement. If those things are intact, there's no way the country will be ungovernable. And you will notice those are the three key institutions that collapsed in the 80s, and the social consequences are there. What about the capacity of the state? Generally, if you look at our government, the economic and finance clusters, at least in the early years of democracy, were the most effective. Over time, the economy deteriorated, particularly in the last decade. The finance cluster nearly collapsed. SARS and so on, it was contained. Capacity of the state. Where is it weakest? Here. In education, and it goes back to the 80s. The only way you can make the country ungovernable is by destroying all authority figures, parents, teachers, and law enforcement. It's weakest in health, it's weakest in safety and security, it's weakest in local government. Sorry, I'm running. Look at the incapacity. Why is this? Human resource imperatives of transformation, particularly in the public service. There's no way the ANC would run a country with apartheid civil servants. That's where the transformation was going to start. But let's face it, you replace them with people who has never even run a spaza shop. That's the reality. Where would they learn to run a government? The other problem of incapacity is the struggle for the soul of the ANC between the various parties, Communist Party, COSATU, ANC itself. What is it all about? The ANC does not have a culture of being civil-minded. Apartheid and the liberation created a culture of disrespect for law. If you make the country ungovernable, you make sure the law becomes dysfunctional, but you can't switch it back. Civil society in South Africa is very strong, good for democracy, very uncontrollable, bad for democracy. Human rights culture, I'll come back to that, and the framework, I'll return to those. I just want to finish. Some of my friends will recognize this, what I'm saying here. I think you will. The impact of civil society was interesting in South Africa. Let's just go into the last. 1961, you had Sharpeville. And there was a lull for 15 years in the country until 1976. That's a difference of 15 years. Another lull until 1984, a break of 8 years. Another lull until for 6 years and 4 years done. And what this is demonstrating here is that the weakness of the apartheid state was getting worse from 1961 till 1984. Look at the gap in years between activism. Miriam, you'll recognize this, won't you? What is this telling us? If you look at capacity of the state from most ineffective to the most effective, where would you put here the most effective government departments? Just any, what would you put there? I think it was the finance cluster. You know, SARS was working, Treasury was working, the finance cluster was top rate. Who would you put here?
Where?
Ineffective. Education. Health.
Police.
Law enforcement. Actually, 90% of governments are in here. Only one or at most two governments are in here. And what this is telling you is that the state was totally ineffective.
I want to put something else into that other box because it's important for discussion. It's important for discussion that there's more than just a finance cluster. The whole system is social grants.
Yes.
However we feel about that whole thing, it's been very successful.
Successful.
Very effective.
Okay, fair enough.
And that is
Yeah.
not treasury.
Yeah, no, I haven't listed all of
No,
them.
no, but I'm just saying, because it's not treasury, I think it's important for your argument.
Good.
I'm not making your argument. I'm
No,
saying
no.
While you're structuring your argument, it's important to see why there are hypotheses about that.
Right.
But it's important to cluster, because there are things that definitely worked.
Oh yeah, no, I agree.
You know, poverty did come down. NSNP, the National School Nutrition Program, is a big success. Whatever we think about the quality of it, it reaches 8 million kids every day, or whatever it is. It's a huge success.
No, I agree with you.
So I think we should look at. I'm not trying to come in, but
Yeah.
let's look at what was successful.
You're not trying to come in.
Yeah. No, Miriam, you're right.
It's a truthful analysis.
And you and I have been through
It's
that.
important not to be dismissive.
No,
Yeah.
you and I have been through that before
Yeah.
in another forum.
Sorry, I spoke for a long
It's
time.
just I don't want to analyze that line for there will be a discussion for us. I totally agree with you.
Yeah.
And look at the engagement of civil society. And that is why, if you want to understand this one, how strong was civil society is to go back to what I said earlier. Look at the intervening years from 61 to 76. It wasn't military, it was civil society that was engaged. Took 15 years. From 76 to 84, that period was half. From 84 to 94, it was half further. And all this is demonstrating is civil society was getting stronger and stronger during that time. So, you have very strong civil society and pretty weak government. That's a very dangerous situation. And this is where you can even begin to see issues of the rising crime and so on, because your state is not sufficiently strong. We will come back to that during discussion. 1994 settlement. Very ultra-liberal constitution. Radical individualism. Strong human rights culture, nothing to complain about. Protection against the state vertically. Protection of private property. Impact on the future, The 1994 settlement created some truce, and that truce was a result of a stalemate, black political power versus white economic power. That was really what creates 1994. CODESA main actors continue battle over the stalemate. Post-1994, your generation, peace must fall. It was a precursor to what will happen. They changed the face of the country, the youth. They foreshadowed 1976, but assumptions and point of departure. I'll skip this one. It's not where I want to convey. What was the political culture? Funny, interesting, the PEE created an outlet for politicians who could be less politically. The ANC single party dominant, weakening, politically rather than militarily sophisticated civil society and civilian control over the army, fearless media, and chronic need for endorsement by the liberal West. Right. Let me look at something missing here. What are the points that I wanted to make? I don't know what is in here. Let me see if there's something coming. It's very interesting. Is that the same? Actually, the key parts of the points I wanted to make.
Everyone is, professor is looking.
No,
that's
that's
pizza.
No, but I can finish it off. Let me go back and summarize by heart some of the points that seem to have disappeared. And I can't blame the staff because all they did was to print what I gave them. You know. You know, in politics you blame the people. I want to come back here and I'll talk to them.
That's your first point.
This one's we have. You can do that. But
I can think what I do.
no, I'm just saying the slides. I'm just looking, I want to go back to that slide with 6 areas that define our political culture, and I will speak to them without slides very quickly. It comes very early in the presentation.
Yeah. We have it here.
Okay, what number is it?
He's got a printout, as you do.
What number is it?
It's like
Speak from the heart.
Slide 34.
Vincent.
slide
Uncle Vince.
34. You see, this is quite
interesting. I must have had a wrong picture.
Slide 10 to
Inductive,
Page
Vince, speak on the numbers.
17. Oh,
He's not taking names.
Page number 17.
Yes.
Which one? Yeah, strong. No, the one that came very early where I was showing you. Where I was showing you the 6 areas.
This one?
Well, I think the one, I think it's number 8.
Number 8.
I think so. Look at number 8, then I
That's
will
number
talk.
8.
But two shapes,
Yeah, I will talk to it. Somehow something got lost, it doesn't matter. That's number 8, right? Slide 8. And I will talk to it and then take discussions. Right, right, this is the slide. I will talk to it because I don't know what happened to it, but I will talk to it very quickly. I've already talked about development within the ANC, and I said on that one, the ANC is pretty much vulnerable going forward. And then, legacy of apartheid, of the past, apartheid and the struggle. I talked about the struggle and what came out of the struggle, basically showing you all those contradictions in the struggle. Capacity of the state. The graphs I showed you there was basically trying to demonstrate that on the left-hand side, on that horizontal line, this is where most of government departments are. And on the extreme right, this is where fewer of the government, so capacity was weak. Civil society, I've demonstrated that. And I can go back to civil society. Anyway, the point we made on civil society, on that horizontal line, on that line that I drew, was it took 1961 from Sharpeville, it took 15 years to 1976, which tells you the struggle. The communities were demoralized. From 76 to 84, when the next major uprising comes, it's 8 years, that period is shortened. And from 84 to 90, it's shortened further by 4 years, 90 to 94. And what we are seeing in that is that while, just continue look for that square, what we are saying here is civil society has been getting stronger and stronger and stronger since 1961. And a strong civil society is a basis for a democratic future. I mean, a terrorized civil society can never be roots of democracy. It comes with chaos and other things, but that's fine. Those who can address much later. And then on the horizon, so are you there? I want to talk to that one. Keep going down.
Keep going down.
Yeah. Right, we talked about this one. You can see the shrinking intervals from 1961. And this only tells you pressure on the government has been very strong. What is the difference? This civil society was fighting a very strong national party government. It was a strong government. And this is the same civil society the ANC had to deal with. And you can see the ANC is battling. The ANC cannot afford to go and shoot down people. It can't. It happened in Marikana and you saw the consequences. And there's a linkage between what happens in Marikana and what happens in the city center here in Joburg when the police said to run away. In Marikana, they did not run away. They protected their ground with guns, and they were heavily criticized. In the city center of Joburg, they said, we can't take another cluster. We better run away, and they ran away. The point I want to look at is civil society is up here, very strong in South Africa. Government, in my opinion, is somewhere here. You can't be mathematical, but it's definitely not this side at all. And do you see the risk? If you have a strong civil society and a very, very weak government, you already have the beginnings of a failed state. We are not there yet. And you can control a failed state by beginning to shoot and move down people. Politically, the ANC cannot afford that. I think as we speak, we are somewhere here. You see? Where do you want to be? You want to be here, where the government is very, very effective and civil society holds it accountable. Here, the civil society is politically much stronger than government actually. That is good for democracy, provided you can deal with the issue of lawlessness and manage it very well. What was the impact? 1994 settlement, ultra-liberal constitution, radical individualism, strong human rights culture, protection, more protection against the state and very little horizontal production, and protection of private property. That's what the Constitution is largely about. Now, how does that impact the future? It was these conditions that I talked about that made the negotiations possible. And that is why we had a kind of truce based largely on a political stalemate. And that stalemate consisted of black political power and white economic power. That was really what was the stalemate. And if you look at what the two actors have been doing here, the ANC has been trying to alter the stalemate, rightly recognizing that political power without economic power is empty. And the National Party constituency has dug in its heels that if we give the economic power also what's left. So expect a major conflict going ahead. This issue is going to be what defines our future going forward. For the National Party constituency, the status quo is fine. Keep the politics, we keep the bank. And the ANC says, no, we want the bank as well. And the National Party constituency says, well, what is left? And as you know, you only negotiate if you have something to salvage. If there's nothing to salvage, you fight. So I think we have the instability built into our system right now. The post-1994 generation, this one is just a point I'm making very, very quickly. If you look at what changed the ANC, by the time Mandela and Tambo were in the Youth League, the ANC was a dying horse. And they revived it. Young people, the Youth League, they were disrupting meetings. I always tell people, Mandela was no different from Malem in terms of dealing with those who were delaying the revolution. They were disrupting meetings all over. What changed the country? The youth in 1976. The country was never the same after 1976. And the question we need to ask is, must we monitor the Feast Must Fall movement as the next group that is going to change the direction of the country? The country has always been shaped by young people, kicked out of slumber by young people. Very, very interesting. I have no views at the moment, but if you are a serious student of politics, you need to monitor the feast must fall movement or anything that follows after that? Was it a one-off thing? Or is it actually the seed of the next revolution in the country, and what form is it going to take? Of course, they are different from the 70s and their points of departures. 76 group was dealing with oppression. Feast must fall are operating in an environment of political freedom. You don't get shot down for criticizing the Vice Chancellor. 1971, I mean, the 70s were about liberation. Feast must fall about accountability and economic empowerment. So, what am I saying? I'm saying our political culture is very strong in the sense that it has a strong private sector. Where you have a strong private sector, politicians have a way out. They don't have to loot the state forever. You know, those who have skills. And the other thing in our culture you must not underestimate, even as a cynic, is the impact of BBBEE. What it has done was to get very, very powerful people, Cyril Ramaphosa, Matthew Posa, to have a vested interest in the survival of the market economy. And they are not the only ones. I'm just saying there are many. What BEE does, it gives those who are part of it. It's a life cover for the private sector. Because then you have the rich blacks as a bastion. And it's very, very interesting. You look everywhere. The middle class are the ones who complain about this all. Because people on the ground are disturbing my investment. It's quite normal. The single party dominant system has slowly weakened. I mean, the ANC started with 66%. And in this election, had Cyril not run, the ANC wouldn't even have made it to 48, 47. For a liberation movement, it's a serious indictment. And that is why I said to you, don't rule out the possibility that the ANC actually is terminally ill. Because the fights are continuing. They are not even coming together. The culture of civilian control over the army is very, very strong and good for democracy. Fearless media and judiciary, the media can go overboard, but rather a strong media than a weak, nice media. And media, it's like many people, if you like it, it's not doing its job. We like the media when it's harassing our enemies, not us. And the chronic need for an endorsement by the West means that this country will always want to maintain its status as a decent government. Going forward, I think there are long-term prospects for a democratic South Africa. Certain current weaknesses are in structure, and I was showing you how some of those things that I mentioned are actually structural issues. And democracy will remain, in my opinion, judiciary independent, media fearless, strong civil society, problematic and very energetic young people. When young people make a statement, they don't discuss, they decide, and you see the fire immediately. There's no risk assessment or any of those kinds of things. So, just to conclude, what am I saying? The key problems, and I'm sorry some of the slides, but it's good, it has been too long. The point I'm making is the problems we are saving are going to require two very, very important institutions at the absolute minimum. When there's such chaos, when there's disorder, the economy is going down, we need a new kind of government. We do. I won't say which kind of government, but I'll give two examples of what this country needs, and that's why I'm next to the door. We need a combination today, if we're lucky, in a funny way. We need a combination of Steve Biko, and we need a combination of Steve Biko and guess who? De Klerk. De Klerk. And let me explain why. Biko, we always say South Africa is where it was in the 80s. No. South Africa is where it was at the end of the 60s. After Sharpeville, directionless, everybody demoralized. Who emerges at that time? Steve Biko. That man was remarkable. I mean, if you haven't met him, you have missed out on one of the giants. And Steve Biko changes the mood of the country radically. The black consciousness did just that. If black consciousness was still intact, there would have been no kinds of violence you saw against foreigners. Black consciousness emphasized the sanctity of black people. It was very clear. And during that period, there was very little violence in the country. Steve Biko was respected across the board because he pushed principles no radical people would have rejected. Why do I say De Klerk? And I can go on. You can take me up on these issues. The most interesting thing about De Klerk is that what he did is what President Ramaphosa needs to do. De Klerk comes in and gives us two things as a country which were very significant. And if you don't believe me, go back to his speech of February 1990. Whether you like it or not, it was the clearest speech you expect from a leader who says, this is the direction I'm taking. If you don't like it, get off the bus. I'm going to release Mandela. I'm going to unbend it. He was very specific about what he was going to do. Very, very specific. And he did that a week later. The ANC, the Communist Party were unbent. But he also does something where P.W. Botha failed dismally. And I think this is the same mistake that Ramaphosa is making. P.W. Botha, we forget, he was so obnoxious that we forget he was the first reformer in the country. He was the first reformer. He scrapped the Mixed Marriages Act. He scrapped the Immorality Act. I joke today, they were not there. And he introduced a number of liberal measures. What was his big mistake? He wanted to bring along Eugene Terblanche and Dries Striernecht. He wanted to get the right wing on the bus. And he ended up as paralyzed as President Cyril appears to be. What does De Klerk come in? He says, number one, I'm going to map out the direction in the most unambiguous terms. And read that speech. He says, number two, I'm going to destroy the right wing. And he destroyed the right wing. He destroyed it. I still think Cyril missed this opportunity, and I'm not taking sides about where I belong. Cyril could have wiped out his enemies in 2 months. What did he need to do? The ANC recalls him. He says, fine. I'll step down as ANC president. But remember, you can't remove me as president of the country. There you need 75% of the votes. There's no way the Zuma group would have mastered those votes. Let's say they kick him out, he says, fine. The next thing he should have done, go on television and says, fellow South Africans, I'm going to call a referendum. And this is my plan. I'm going to arrest all the thieves. I'm going to improve. He should have put 4 things that he knows every South African wants. And say, do you agree with me? Put it to a referendum. He would have swept it. And guess what? Would Ace Mahashule
says, no, we disagree with the end of corruption. None of his enemies would have opposed him. And then he gets a national mandate. And he says to the ANC, comrades, let's be clear. The people have given me a mandate. We have two options. Like de Klerk, you get onto the bus. And if you don't get onto the bus, I'm going to call an election with a new party. You would have wiped them out. But what does he do? Something the Bible warns us about those who read the Bible. It says, blessed is the peacemaker, because you get a kick from all sides. And this is what Cyril is getting right now. Let me take a break here. You can see it was just a long thing, just with a single argument. That I think the ANC is on its decline. I don't see its resurrection much sooner. I don't know who is there. If we are able to incarnate Steve Biko and de Klerk, their combined skills would have taken us further, but we can't. And yeah, we need that. And the young generation, the post-1994 generation, if you have any thoughts, tell us what to do. Biko was in his 20s when he led the whole country. Young people, you don't need to be 50 before you can actually be able. A leader might actually come from your ranks. And yeah, let's take it here. It was wide, and I'm sorry some slides got lost, but thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much. So colleagues, I think we should have a conversation. When people have questions, they can raise questions, comments, so keep it informal. So let's start with you.
Thank you. Fascinating take on quite a number of key issues. I really like how you presented it. And I'll tell you the area that I really like is those pillars that you presented. I would have also wanted to hear more on the historical element, what makes ANC be what it is, I mean, the nature, because you said a lot of things in the beginning. You said, please, in the West, yeah, the economic dimension, I mean, and treasury, as much as it's a success, it's also a problem, but I would like to explain. But the entire ANC, Mongani addressed some of these issues, that they very self-elite, they never wanted to liberate the country in any way different. They wanted to be accepted, co-option within the system. So there's, throughout the history of AIDS, the church, and all those who were going to visit the Queen and to plead with the Queen to release land, has been consistent, want to be accepted by the West. So I mean, I'm not surprised that post-94, there's that consistent, even with some of the worst disastrous policies coming from the West, they still do your typical Westerner approach in to give advice on any key issue, which they have no idea. That's where we differ from Eastern countries, where they have their own indigenous thinking and feed it into the state. On ANC, you have slight, I would say disagreement, but I don't think you would put them into this clearly defined pillars because there are quite a number of zigzag elements or individual who fit in all. They were at Robben Island, they were in exile, and there's this huge issue of those in exile feeding into domestic as a strategy of making South African governable. I'm not sure if it was really, it came out as a design or accident, but some argue that it was strategized in Lusaka, not in Soweto. So it's quite interesting. I agree with the point, but I just wonder if it was really internal people who did that. My final thoughts are all on what we consider as a success. Between policies and treasury. I think with recent crises, the good days and everything, has opened more than we thought. Definitely that we must also give President Zuma a warrant that this Zondo Commission will open more than what we bargained for. We now see more than what we thought. I think what is coming out, how captured the state itself was. And this capturing goes beyond 1994. That the history of South African state, it's a history of capturing. And by much more bigger forces, both internally and externally. It's all coming out, and you can just see if you follow that. The Constitution, correct me if I'm wrong, it has special clause on the treasury. It's protected by the Constitution. So it's a super department. And one wonders why it was ring-fenced in the negotiation and not education and not health. Key issues where I agree with people is issues the struggle and the damage of our public was much more in the mind of people. And the post-1994 project was its dismal failure to reverse the mental damage of one person in general, and that weaknesses cut across those in government and on the streets. That project failed dismally in terms of reorienting the state and empowering. You do that, not just ring-fencing departments, but you also look at the bank states in terms of policy intervention. And then I doubt if any work was done to really, it was a question of reintroducing apartheid. That's what was stick. People spend more time on the road, and who are those people? Like poor and everything that apartheid created. It's now really thriving now more than it did. Thank you.
Can I just ask a question before I comment? Are you looking for feedback on this presentation or on a project that you're doing? Does this represent a project that you're working on?
It represents my thought in process, and I'm looking for feedback and comments.
As a kind of project, or?
I'm not sure if I understand the question.
It means, are you planning to do more work and you're looking for new categories of thinking? Or did you just want to comment just on this presentation as it is?
No, you can comment
So,
any way you like, am I right?
I'll just make some comments, not even necessarily questions. I'm also kind of, as you know, I'm engaging in some thinking, not exactly the way you're doing it, but about the behavior of why we're stuck as a country. So that's, I'm applying my mind, which is also for both of us a little unusual. I'm normally thinking I can solve the problem, and now I'm thinking there's some kind of psychological problem, and I think it does partly relate to what you've just said. So, on that note, the first thing is, well, it comes to the, okay, let's start with what you were talking about. What are the causes of self-harm? I'm not asking a question. I'm just saying we have to come to grips with why self-harm. And I think it partly relates to what you're saying. There's something like when we say it's xenophobic violence, actually it's not. You didn't have to go to apologize to anybody because it was an inward. It always is. It's almost always an inward fight, right? They're not actually against foreigners. They just damage, like, get hit by it like everyone else does.
Really?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. If you look at the guys.
You get your chance now.
Yeah. You can say what you like, but the point is that when you look at in the final analysis of who dies in what's considered xenophobic violence, and that's been true for years, it's almost always majority local. Okay, so we have to think carefully about why are we so violent and why just come to ourselves, if we can say. If you know what I'm saying, it's the point you're making. That's what I mean by those words. I think also, and I'm not going in any particular order, just in the order I have this. So I'm trained as an economist, and I think in terms of, so resource-based economy, highly unequal, those two things generally go together. Lack of investment in people is typical of the situation we're in. So the first thing is, if you were doing a study, I would have done I would get out of this zone, because we're so in it, you know, and be thinking other countries that face similar kinds of problems. Because I think one of the problems, firstly, is just sheer being removed. You can be. If you're in Singapore or Korea or a country that doesn't have resources, as you know, you have to invest in institutions and people. You have nothing else. If you're thinking that you don't care that your country's not moving forward, it's not a problem. But if you do want to progress your country, then you have to invest in people and in institutions, because it's all you have. In a country that has resources, you can keep chugging along, and then you come into a resource boom, as we did for a period of time, up to 2008, and you're buffered from it, and you don't have to deal with people, right? So we haven't been investing in people, institutions, education. Yeah, we've been investing in it, but we haven't really, the thing about Treasury was that there was a huge investment in the capability of this cohesive group of people. They were really trying to get professionalized and learn about what this profession was and get better and better and better at what they were doing and strengthening, and they created whatever, however upset people were about gear. There were also other elements like open budgeting. Money was transferred into social programs. Unlike, sort of a neoliberal policy, money did actually start flowing into social programs. So the reason I was raising the social grants point is where we've been good, I think, is where you have a narrow, you're handing out grants. Where we're not so good is, or getting the budget right, where we're not so good is where you need an institution that deals with a lot of a lot of transactions, a lot of activities, education, health, anything like that seems to be where we don't do well. But I think the point is that the new elites, like the old elites, didn't have to have much to do with, I think there's a lot, you see it more and more and more, that talking at people. There's actually very, very little engagement, and it's gotten worse and worse over time, I think. So that's one thing. Then the other question is, why is there no other compelling party? So I think that there's a huge gap that could have been created, for the DA, for the EFF, or anybody to say, I care about food, or I care about education. Instead, like when the DA, I got an automated call from the DA for some reason, and it talked about immigrants, and it said, we're the only party, it was like Trump, we're the only party that's going to fight corruption, immigration. No other party's going to hold the borders. They didn't say, this is how we're going to create jobs, this is what we're going to do about education, this is how we're going to make sure you've got sanitation. When I saw Musia and I asked him about it, he said, well, that's how we're engaging with the rural areas. And I thought, you're sending an automated message in English so you can connect to people in the rural areas? It's just a stupid answer, right? Obviously that's not why he was doing it, but it was so ridiculous as a point, because you'd think that they could step in and say, ANC has not done what they need to do around education. We care about children, and they didn't do that. Neither is the EFF. Now, next point, when you say that Ramaphosa could get up in front of the nation and say, we're going to have corruption now, I'm guessing that actually a lot of people would not agree with him and not want to do with it. If you look at how captured, how much patronage there is right across the local government system, the amount of people who depend on patronage as their livelihood, I would guess that he would not succeed, he might be dead the next day. I'm not sure that people would rally around. And again, I'm not asking a question or making a statement, I'm thinking a category of thinking. And then the question is, why is there corruption on this scale? Again, not a question, just a way of thinking.
Okay. I'm just going to respond briefly to the point on the xenophobia, and I think it's important we have fact-based discussion. The Wits African Center for Migration Studies released statistics showing that 350 foreigners had been killed in xenophobic attacks between 2008 and 2015. I lived in Cape Town for quite a long time, and in a 6-month period in 2006, 31 Somali shopkeepers were killed. In the 2008 violence, most of the 62 people killed were from Zimbabwe, Malawi, and Mozambique. So I think it's very important when we discuss that we actually discuss on the basis of facts. I wanted to, Prof, just respond to you. I thought it was a very provocative presentation, which is the whole point of it, and to get feedback. But your portrayal of the National Party as anti-colonial and a liberation was a bit too provocative for me, I think, personally speaking. I think that this is a bit perverse. They were liberating less than 5% of or about 5% of the population. They were also, once they had entered into the Union of South Africa, I mean before, they were controlling also Orange Free State, Transvaal. They were effectively colonialists as far as the majority was concerned. So I think I'd just like you to maybe nuance that a little bit, because I don't think I'm the only one that's going to find it provocative. I think also one has to recognize that they may have had more capacity, but they were also catering for a 10% minority population rather than an 80% population that an ANC has to cater for. And I think we have to take that into account. I thought you were a bit unfair on Mbeki and Oliver Tambo. I think they held the movement together under very difficult circumstances and played an incredibly skillful and tactful hand diplomatically. And I think they have more strategic insight than you have given them, in my view anyway, having studied them. And my final point also on de Klerk, I think de Klerk remains an unconstructed segregationist, as his interview with Christian Amanpour showed on CNN. There was so much international pressure that I don't think he had a choice with the economy on its heels. At least he had the good sense, though, unlike PW, to do the right thing. But I don't think he had a choice, and I don't think de Klerk should be given as much credit as some revisionist historians try to give him.
That's a question then. Yeah. So thank you for the insightful presentation. It gave me quite a bit to think about. So there's just 3 broad questions that I think I'd just like clarity on. And I think the first thing that I missed in your presentation is you present all of these cultures, but then there is no way where you are giving some sort of formulation or thesis in terms of how these things are filtering to cause whatever situation that we have in the country. It's almost like you're saying that here we had a military culture, we're here with this, and then you're not saying how these things are interacting to create the final product that we have. So for me, that I thought was missing a bit. So it almost felt very like you imply some causal link without having necessarily explicitly, for me, made me comfortable that there is a causal link. I think the second issue is on the notion where you mentioned that there's a lack of ownership in terms of South Africans for the country and its problems. And I suppose one interesting, perhaps underlying question for me that arises there is the assumption that we've made that we all know who's South African, right? And I'm not even talking about this whole xenophobic issue. I'm talking, if you look at the ANC with its assimilationist posture, is that we're all assimilating, well, not, well, inherently the way the system is structured is we are assimilating into some culture that has been created, whether it be in corporates or in institutions, right? And to that extent that we are assimilating, then it's almost like we are degenerating in terms of culture, and we're losing who we are. And it's almost like the only valid form of being South African is some institutional form that has been pre-designed by the previous regime, right? So I think for me, in that sense, is that when we start talking about ownership, perhaps do people feel that they're South African to start off with? Does somebody that's living in the township or in the squatter camps feel that they're South African to participate in the system? I think that is something that we gloss over. We tend to assume that there is a common understanding of what it means to be South African. The second last point is the notion where you spoke a bit about civil society. I think the other major epistemic assumption that we're making here, right, is that civil society always needs to be oppositional to government to some extent in order to keep a government accountable and to act as a check and a balance, right? But then part of the structural problem that we have in the country is because of the racially segregated and bifurcated nature of our society, is that civil society then becomes an advocacy group for a certain interest group or a certain minority, right? So therefore, any check or balance inherently tends to have some sort of counter-revolutionary impact. So I'd just like that, a comment on that also. And the final point that I'd just like to ask, perhaps also the lady economist, Ms. Jolene, maybe can opine on that. I think there's this trope that Treasury is like the most efficient or most competent department in government, right? But I think for me, that comes from a basis of a narrow, bureaucratic, professionalized metric of what it means to be efficient, right? Because the other argument that could be made is that in terms of the policies that they've been advocating, in terms of the lack of financing and access for black people, there's actually gross incompetence there. Even though within some neoliberal metric, they're actually very competent in serving the financial services sector very well. But in the broader society, there's actually been an abject failure. So.
Any other questions?
Shall I start and we take the next round?
We have about 15 minutes to go. Try to have.
Can I just add a...
Just that, maybe you respond.
Oh no, maybe go.
Maybe just, okay. So you.
Can people introduce themselves?
Yeah, that's
Okay. I'm Radovitz from Wits International Relations. Mine's just a quick follow-up on the point on civil society that was just raised. I was a little confused at the parts of your talk because there's a range of conceptions of civil society, and I mean to kind of make them cartoonish. One is the kind of anti-government view of civil society, and the other sort of as an autonomous sphere, sort of an alternative governance model. And it seemed like as you went through, when you talked about civil society, sometimes you had the one in mind and other times you had the other in mind. And when you put the diagram up with the state effectiveness versus civil society, I wasn't really sure that these two things were going in the same direction. I mean, you can have the anti-governability side being very strong at the same time, the sort of alternative government side is weak and vice versa. And whether we just pull those two apart.
Thank you, Professor, for what I think is such an inspiring crash course in South African history and politics. If there's one thing that I truly admire in terms of how we dealt with our transition and the preparation of our constitution is this whole idea of the core values that constitute our constitution. And I am concerned that increasingly, I think we are seeing a lot of those values disintegrating. What's the word?
Disintegrating.
Yeah, disintegrating in a very big way. So would you maybe perhaps speak very briefly on this really troubling issue of re-racialization? Re-racialization.
You touched on the fact that the ANC government is very infatuated with peace in the West. I want to understand where the ANC deviated from Steve Biko's ethos of pan-Africanism, and where distrust in us as Africans come from? Is it part of the problem that ANC failed to redress what the apartheid government created, where it was a distrust in ourselves, and therefore we have a strong distrust of not only other African states but also our ability as a people to make decisions that are good for ourselves. You mentioned that ANC has a strong culture in consultation, but whenever they do consult, it seems, even with the evidence provided, there's still a reluctance to apply the knowledge that's been gained. So I want to just speak on the the xenophobic attacks are also evidence of the self-hate that's there. So I want to just touch on the fact that ANC failed to redress any of the self-hate that was created in apartheid, and therefore spills into us not assimilating with the rest of Africa. And another thing is because the liberation had several attacks on the education system. Do you think that also has a direct impact on the fact that the government now has a mistrust with academia? There's been countless times where politicians have looked at academia as the opposition, and that has all its implications. So could you just maybe touch on that?
Before we give you a chance to answer, I just have a comment, because we presented quite a lot of things. I was thinking theoretically, how do we deal with this? Because it's a lot of factors we've put on the table. Yeah, what is the theoretical framework that perhaps should assist us to explain what is going on, and perhaps to make some predictions moving forward, and maybe if the predictions may not be accurate. But I do think that we need a bit of a theoretical framework, and you should forgive me, I'm a sociologist by training. So what I may suggest may be suspect. It seems to me perhaps one thing that ties everything else that we have said, or maybe to express it differently, maybe we should follow where the power lies. I mean, basically, we could even think of the power resources or the concentration of power, and that actually, if you follow that, I mean, who holds power, who doesn't have power, it might explain quite a lot of things about what is going on in South Africa and where South Africa is likely to go. I mean, even in explaining which state institutions have performed better and which state institutions have not performed well. That actually, if you check the power thing, it will tell you. I just want to give a few examples to see whether this applies. Now, I mean, if you take the National Treasury, because there was huge investment in the National Treasury, in SARS, and these other finance, economic ministries that you mentioned. Now, when you think about it, is why there was so much investment in those institutions. It's quite interesting, because that is where elite interest, in a sense, lied. I mean, the functioning economy is quite critical. And so there's a lot of interest, a lot of investment in resources, good human resources, financial resources, but also investing in political capital to make sure that those institutions work. It's interesting in the case of education, health, which are the institutions, in a sense, that we have posed as dysfunctional. Because those are institutions where poor people in the main are reliant on. And there's an odd case of SASSA, and I would like to talk a bit about SASSA, because SASSA serves a predominantly poor constituents, and yet it is one institution that has worked well. So theoretically, it's quite an odd case that needs to be explained. But I mean, in the case of education and health, because when you say the privileged classes, and that includes almost all of us who are here, who have exited those institutions. And the people really who are left there are poor people without much political leverage. And so there is no investment by the state to change things in any dramatic way in those institutions. I can tell you, if you had, I mean, the problems we have had in education and health are worse than the problems that led to the establishment of the Zonal Commission. The problems have been far, far, far worse in health and education. We can go on and on and on. But because what led state capture, especially state capture in the economic side of the state, had such huge consequences for elite interests. That's the reason why there is this move at self-correction. So this is the power dynamic that I think we need to constantly check. I mean, even what you say about the ANC looking to the West, that is a typical elite predisposition in a sense. We care about how we are perceived. So we might have a dismal education system. That is a problem, but actually that's not the primary problem. Even on these xenophobic attacks, it's quite interesting what concerns government. It's not that the fact that there are people who died and all of those things, the perception how South Africa is perceived outside. These are the elites thinking about the problems. What the source of the conflict is really not the primary issue. Because the people who are fighting foreigners, it's not us who are around this table. I mean, Hage is my friend, even though he's Nigerian, so it doesn't matter.
Even though. I would say
I'm saying even though, in certain places, I mean, in poor communities, the fact that Ade is Nigerian would be a problem. But for us, it's
so
really...
He's my friend and he is Nigerian.
He's Nigerian, he's not even...
Yes.
He's Nigerian. But actually, if you go to poor neighborhoods, the fact that Ade is a Nigerian national is a problem. Actually, it might expose him to harm. Because they experience the issue of immigration differently than we do. So we tend to react differently to the same phenomenon. But what really the state reacts to is how we perceive the problem of immigration as privileged classes rather than those poor people who are there. So, I mean, what I'm trying to suggest here is that perhaps what ties everything together that we have said is this power. I mean, who has power and who doesn't have power. And just one conceptual issue on state weakness. I mean, I think the South African state is really not necessarily weak. It might be dysfunctional in certain areas, but I think the problem we face is the responsive, or is the lack of responsiveness of the state in certain areas. So in education, in health, with all the problems, but the fundamental problem is not the weakness of the state. Because when you look, I mean, when people are standing in a long line, you do not need huge capacity to deal with that problem. I mean, you find someone who sits on the other side of the counter, and you have been standing for 5 hours, and then they tell you are going out for lunch. Even though you came early in the morning, you have stood there for 5 hours. But they say it's lunchtime, I'm going, it's no problem how you deal. That is not a capacity issue. It is a responsiveness issue. It's a state really that doesn't care much about certain groups in society, which goes back to the issue of power, who has power and who doesn't have power. I don't know, I'm just suggesting that, I mean, perhaps as the first thing that let's look at where power is and how it explains how the state institutions and state actors are acting.
And again, you touched on the fact that during the negotiations, the ANC had the political power and the government at the time had the financial power. So I want to ask to also explore if the dynamic has changed. And if it hasn't changed, then how useful is political power in this term?
Thank you. Very, very helpful comment. And maybe the first thing I should start with, very, very helpful, as I say, is to remind you what I was doing. I wasn't evaluating South Africa. I wasn't evaluating how far are we. I wasn't evaluating who are the devils or the angels. If this thing is circulated, slide 8 actually gives you a sense of what my paper is all about. It says the point I was trying to make was if we are trying to get a modicum of where the country is going, there are 6 areas we need to study very closely. That's what I was saying. And I said there are developments within the ANC, there are legacy of the struggle, capacity of the state, participation of civil society, impact of the settlement in '94, and the post-1994 generation. That was really the point I was making, that these issues are interconnected in such a way that they shape the future. I think that was the core of what I was saying. I wanted to emphasize, and invariably, I left out many things because I wasn't talking about South African things in general. Now let me deal with specific issues, and I will not take them in any order because I'm talking about. Professor Mia, you talk more about the historical element, what explains what is the nature of the ANC, its Western orientation. I think there are many things, it's not a single thing. First of all, like anywhere else, the ANC was largely a middle-class party founded by missionary, trained people. I mean, I personally never have seen a revolutionary fervor. And if you look even at the old documents, and you made the point, you answered your own question actually. The ANC, it was about accommodate us in your structures. I think it was really the thrust of the ANC. It was never about we are going to turn everything upside down. That comes much later with young people saying we have had enough. So in many ways, what eventually happened, it was mission accomplished. We now are in, we get paid as much as whites, and I'm oversimplifying it. I'm saying it is not surprising. It was started by the middle class, no particular revolutionary thrust. The revolutionary thrust comes largely through the Communist Party. It's almost the one that is talking about an alternative society, and I think that is why you have the two theories, first the democratic, the national revolution, and the real revolution. I think it captures that kind of sentiment. What is success? Success for me is again not a value judgment. It's doing what you have set out to do. Treasury had specific aims it wanted to achieve, and it achieved them. It was pretty clear, fiscal discipline, all of those things. And I'm not passing value judgment, you know. If you are in soccer and the opposition team scored, you may not like the fact that they scored, but they did score. Then all I was simply saying, it succeeded in what it was trying to do. Whether it's good or not, it's a different issue altogether. And give the converse of that. The record of the police is dismal. I mean, when they were running away from the city center of Joburg, it wasn't the first time. The police were on record where they publicly requested that private security companies guard the police stations. I mean, this is shocking. This is absolutely shocking. And so when I'm talking about success, it's not about do I like what you did. It's simply about are you doing what you were set out to do. And I'm just saying, overall, the tax people collected tax. And I'm saying Trevor Manuel with his neoliberal politics, he executed them. That's all I'm saying. We can talk about that, and I'm just saying, if you look within departments, you will find that most of them are on the left, where really in terms of achieving what they were achieving. I don't want to undermine social development, but writing checks is the easiest thing. You know, in the private sector, my job was also to have CSI program. Now that one doesn't require a lot of hard work. You just need to know where to put the signature and amount. I would even go further to say the size of our social payments is indication of the failure of our economy. The bigger your social budget, the poorer your economic policy, because if people were working, they wouldn't need that money. So for me, all I'm saying is, even though social development did what it was supposed to do, I'm prepared to say it was a success. But if you are putting a value judgment as we are putting on other things, you would say it's actually a good example of failure. That you have failed to create jobs for so many people. So I think that's what I meant by a thing. Now you talked about the mental damage. I'm surprised you missed the point that I said the first leader we need is a people. That was the thrust of his message, that South Africa needs a mental revolution. And what I find interesting about Biko, go and read his readings again, the most interesting thing, the very first publication was a scathing attack on liberals. Subsequent publications were scathing attack on black people. And I remember the second one, the title was We Blacks. And Steve Biko emphasizes the point that until as black people, we get our act right on a number of critical things, we are wasting time. He was basically saying that psychological revolution was kind of dismissed. But I actually still agree with Biko that it doesn't matter what you got right. If you are still a mental and cultural slave, you are getting nowhere. And that is why one of you asked, how do we explain these violences and so on? I agree, I don't know who said it. Resort to violence is usually a sign of lack of self-respect. And if you burn down things, it's because you are not even aware that actually I'm the government now. You are still a slave. So I think that is why I started with people. And on de Klerk, I think we may have talked past each other. I gave de Klerk credit for two things that I think are indisputable. He mapped out what he was going to do and he did it. Number two, he destroyed the right wing. Now that is historically a fact. I've never said he's my hero. I'm simply saying what you expect from every leader. Shall I make it worse for you? Look at Margaret Thatcher. When she came into power, she said, my job is to smash the unions. And she went ahead to do it. I'm not saying, therefore, she's my hero. What I'm saying is our president had been deputy president for 5 years. It wasn't like he came from Mars and thrown into a situation he knew about. He should already have had a plan to say, when I become president, I've identified the following issues and I'm going to deal with them headlong. That's again the point I was making. If I miss your question, I don't want to say more about xenophobia. It had more airtime last time, but I wasn't sure why you said I didn't give credit to Maggie and Tambo.
That was for being strategic.
No, I didn't even go there. By the way, Maggie is my hero. It's just that's not what I'm trying to talk about today. The only point I make about Mbeki and Thabo was that they belong to another culture of the civil service in the ANC. That was the only point I was making. And to say that culture had certain characteristics. That's all. I wasn't saying they were good or bad.
The Lucifer Bureaucrats, though, sounded to me as if you were saying that Mandela and Sisulu were the most strategic leaders, and the internal leaders were the ones that were the most strategic thinkers. That's how I read it.
No. Well, it's a pity it came across that way, and maybe it's my fault. But remember, even in history, you make periods in history, but it doesn't mean they are clear-cut and related to each other. Of course, if you look at the slide I showed a common slide, a common pillar of underground work, which was present in all of them. What I was giving you was a dominant culture in all of those, rather than a full descriptive, exhaustive thing that they were saying. So the one on Becky is a result of my failure to make myself clear. And on the declared one, I made that point in the same way I said Margaret Thatcher came with a plan and she executed it. And that's all I'm saying. Nothing beyond that one. Let me come to the theoretical framework. That there's no theoretical framework in the sense that I was simply saying, here are the 5 issues we need to understand if we are going to see the future of the country. That was the only point. How we begin to interrogate them is a different matter, and this is not what I was doing today here. But I want to come to the issue of where you say investment, laws invested in finance. Actually, our biggest investment is in health and education. That's interesting. And they are the most disastrous. Let me come with another theory that I want to explore more. I actually think this country, and I've hinted it, but I want to elaborate. The 3 areas that are going to be vulnerable and most difficult to deal with are going to be education, education, health, and thing. And why? You touched on it. These 3 departments are the ones from which your professional and your black professional and middle class is estranged from. Many of us, our children are in private schools. Many of us go to private clinics for treatment. And many of us have ADT and coin for protection. And the point I was making about the African middle class, that they actually understood that those areas are the responsibility of the state. And because your African middle class use those public institutions, they made sure these institutions function. Your black middle class is totally estranged from that. It's a very funny thing that 1994, actually, the black middle class has actually been strengthening white institutions. Our children went to white schools, and we served on the PTAs of those schools. We donated to those schools. So actually, and that is where I brought in Malema. I still feel, I don't think you can do it constitutionally. However, if there was a rule which was saying all public servants, all politicians, you use only public institutions, I tell you they will improve overnight. They will. That was the only point that I was making about these institutions. They serve the poor, and you're right, public institutions have come refugee camps for the poor. And all the teachers of SAT have their children either in private schools or in Model C schools. If their children were in those schools, they would turn up for teaching every day. So those are things I'm saying, if you are looking at the future of the country, there are tough decisions that need to be taken against them, about them. And to add to that, I'm saying because these problems that are rising for the 6 things I mentioned, one way of dealing with them is that you need a new kind of leadership. One that is decisive, and that's where de Klerk came in, but one that can inspire everybody, black, white, yellow, and green. And I think Biko was that kind of leader who had the capacity to draw everybody. The second thing I didn't mention, you need a new UDF. This is where civil society comes in. The beauty of the UDF, it was not an organization. Everybody was part of it who subscribed to certain core values. And you would want UDF as a new center of civil service, which is not counter-revolutionary. So that for me are two key institutions, a new type of leader and a new type of a civil service. Where on power, well, I agree with you about the middle class, but if you notice, this problem is only in South Africa. I'm looking at the middle class in China, in Asia, and in some Islamic countries. They are pretty clear that this is our country, this is the way we do things. They don't care about endorsement. If we have to chop your hand because you are stealing, we don't care what Amnesty International says. And the point I'm simply making is South Africa hasn't reached a point, not of cutting people's heads, but of saying, we have listened to you, but this is the way we do things. Take it or lump it. Capacity and responsiveness agree. They could be interchangeably. For me, capacity simply means, are you able to do what you do? The police only knew how to shoot people. They shot them in Marigana, we criticized them. They ran away from these ones instead of shooting them, we criticized them. And what I'm saying is the police have no political leadership and the proper orientation that this is how you do your job without violating human rights, and that is why they are so useless, in my opinion. Self-harm, xenophobia, National Party, Liberation Party, it was fighting the British for Afrikaners. That's what I meant by a liberation movement.
No, I know what you meant.
Yeah.
I still find it perverse, that's all.
Well, but it's a fact, some facts are perverse. I'm just saying the National Party was a liberation movement through the Ossebrandwag, which fought the British and so on. And the reason I make these parallels, I'm testing one of my theories to say, do liberation movements necessarily arrive at a certain kind of society post-liberation? Because that is the theory proved quite strongly among certain Western political scientists, especially in Stanford, where they would be arguing, watch how the liberation was gained, and you will know what kind of society you are going to have. So that was the only point. But they were a liberation movement, they fought the British and won. That was the only thing. And de Klerk not by choice, as I say, that's not the point whether it was a choice or not for me. The choice is he did it. That's all I'm saying. And I still believe Cyril could have done it, but that's debate, is my belief. Rod, you talk about the unbundling civil society more, and you're right, it's a very, very diffuse concept. It's just a question of time not allowing it. What I meant by it in this most general sense were people who were not structurally aligned to government, structurally part of government. And the points you raise are important, like what is this Afrikaner right-wing labor?
Solidarity.
Solidarity is part of civil society. So is COSATU. I'm aware of those contradictions, but all I'm making is a government needs somebody who is not part of it, who can hold it accountable. It doesn't matter from which orientation. That was the point, but it is complicated, and we can
deal with that. And somebody asked, why did the ANC deviate from Steve Biko? I wish you didn't ask me that question. Point one, the ANC did not deviate from Steve Biko. It never agreed with him. And the so-called black-on-black violence didn't start with the IFP. It starts with the UDF against Black Consciousness Movement. It's a sad thing. It wasn't started by the third force. So, ANC never believed in, was never part of Steve Biko. And one of the things we need to explore in future is why is it the people who received the most ruthless form of apartheid were Sobukwe and Mbibi? Yes. We need to deal with that question. And I think it's because these two organizations got the key issue right. That black people, until you are united, you are wasting your bloody time. Sorry for my language. And anybody knows there's nothing as lethal as united people who are oppressed. Their unity is power in that sense. So these things are not accident at all. Self-funding, Tambo, generating society, causal. You talked about the causal links I made. Was it in those 4 things?
Yeah, so for example, an example speaking about this UDF issue, right? Because when Mbeki came to power, sort of like collapsed those entire UDF structures. So any capacity for communities to be able to organize was sort of like destroyed and that type of thing. So for me, in terms of like this militarization and this autocratic centralization of power, that would be a type of mechanism where I'm looking for, as opposed to just saying that there was militarization and I don't know exactly how it led to the current society that we have.
Well, I thought I dealt with it very briefly. I said militarization was not very strong in South Africa, very strong in Zimbabwe.
Oh no, militarization is just one example, like all the different cultures and factors.
Yeah, but I tried to say I'm at the level of correlation. I haven't yet reached the point where I can say this caused that. But also, past experience can be a good method of justifying something. And all I'm saying is a strong civil society with a weak government, combined with a government of weak capacity, are the roots of a failed state eventually, unless you strengthen the capacity. The violence against foreigners, the point we miss is whether it's xenophobia or not. And it's a very interesting thing. Speak to Afrikaner farmers. They say the government is not protecting us. Speak to women. They say government is not protecting us. Speak to foreigners. They say government is not protecting us. May I ask you, who is government protecting? So we are essentially dealing with the incapacity of government to protect anyone. I mean, my house was burgled 2 years ago. I go to the police, you know what they said to me? They said, my brother, we want to be honest with you, we don't waste our time on these things. We won't find these people. They are foreigners, we don't have their fingerprints, even if we come to take your window. And they say to me, however, these people actually prefer to be arrested because they will get 3 meals a day. Now, I'm a citizen, police telling me we can't get these people. What are they saying to me? Shoot them. And are you surprised that state failure, as I said, to own the country, wherever the state fails, the vacuum is closed by other people, the regional warlords take over. And the rise of the EFF is directly linked to the failure of capacity of the state. Because Malema stands up and says the government is confused, let me give you an easy solution. That's what Eugene Branch also said when the National Party was waffling.
And all I'm saying is, many problems where we see a grade of malafide and conspiracy theories boil down to the fact that we have a government that cannot do its job, and other people will do it for them. So let me take a break here. If I haven't answered your question, through your permission, you can engage me after the meeting. But thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you.
Yes.